Major structural changes in the intelligence community were brought about by the consolidation of cryptanalysis and related functions. Code breaking is a vital part of technical intelligence collection and has had an important role in the history of U.S. intelligence efforts. The American, quote, Black Chamber, end quote, is responsible for breaking German codes in World War I, was abolished in the 1920s. As World War II approached, cryptanalysis received increased attention from the military. Both the Army and Navy had separate cryptologic services which had combined to break the Japanese code, known as, quote, the magic, end quote. This information signaled an impending attack on Pearl Harbor, but the intelligence and alert system as a whole failed to respond. In order to unify and coordinate defense, cryptologic, and communications security functions, President Truman created the National Security Agency by executive order on November 4, 1952. Prior to this time, U.S. cryptologic capabilities resided in the separate agencies of the Army, Navy, and Air Force. The very existence of still the most secret of all U.S. intelligence agencies, NSA, was not acknowledged until 1957. H. The, quote, protracted conflict, end quote. With the end of the Korean conflict, and as the mid-1950s approached, the intelligence community turned from the desperate concern over imminent war with the USSR to the long-term task of containing and competing with communism. In the, quote, struggle for men's minds, end quote, covert action developed into large-scale clandestine psychological and political program aimed at competing with Soviet propaganda and front organizations in international labor and student activities. Specific foreign governments, considered antithetical to the United States and its allies, or too receptive to the influence of the Soviet Union, much as Mossadegh in Iran in 1953 and Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954, were toppled with the help of the CIA. Anti-communist parties and groups were given aid and encouragement, such as the Sumatran leaders who, in 1958, sought the overthrow of President Sukarno of Indonesia. At the same time, the CIA was moving into the field of technical intelligence and reconnaissance in a major way. The U.S. military had recognized the value of aerial reconnaissance within a few short years after the Wright brothers' successful flight in 1903, and had borne major responsibility for reconnaissance against communist bloc countries. But it was the CIA in 1959 that began work on the U-2. It proved to be a technical triumph. The U-2 established that the Soviet Union was not, as had been feared, about to turn the tables of strategic balance. It gained more information about Soviet military developments than had been acquired in the previous decade of espionage operations. But there were risks in this operation. Let me read that again. It gained more information about Soviet military developments than had been acquired in the previous decade of espionage operations. But there were risks in this operation. Despite the effort to minimize them with a special system of high-level NSC review and approval, Francis Gary Powers was shot down in a U-2 over the Soviet Union on the eve of the Paris Summit Conference in 1960. President Eisenhower's acceptance of responsibility and Nikita Khrushchev's reaction led to the collapse of the conference before it began. Nonetheless, the U-2 proved the value of exotic and advanced technical means of intelligence collection. It was followed by a end of page 32, beginning of page 33, formation of the intelligence community. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, large budgets for the development and operation of technical collection systems created intense competition among the military services and the CIA and major problems in management and condensation. To support the Director of Central Intelligence task of coordinating the activities of the intelligence community, the United States Intelligence Board, USIB, was established in 1958, made up of senior representatives of the State Department, the Department of Defense, the military services, Treasury since 1973, and the FBI. USIB was to coordinate the setting of requirements for intelligence, approve national intelligence estimates, and generally supervise the operations of the intelligence agencies. However, the real power to set requirements and allocate resources to the intelligence programs remain decentralized and in the hands of principal collectors, the military services, the foreign service, and the clandestine service of the CIA. As collection programs mushroomed, USIB proved unequal to the task of providing centralized management and eliminating duplication. 1. Third World Competition and Nuclear Crisis. While the United States' technical, military, and intelligence capabilities advanced, concern intensified over the vulnerability of the newly independent nations of Africa and Asia to communist subversion. And in the Western Hemisphere, the establishment of a communist Cuba by Fidel Castro was seen as presaging a major incursion of revolutionary communism to the Western Hemisphere. At his inauguration in January 1961, President Kennedy proclaimed that America would, quote, pay any price and bear any burden, end quote, so that liberty might prevail in the world over the, quote, forces of communist totalitarianism, end quote. Despite the catastrophe of the CIA-sponsored Bay of Pigs invasion, only 4 months later, the covert action and paramilitary operations staffs of the CIA were to shoulder a significant part of that burden. In Latin America, the Alliance for Progress, the overt effort to help modernize the southern half of the hemisphere, was accompanied by a significant expansion of covert action and internal security operations aimed at blocking the spread of Castro's influence or ideology. This was accompanied by an intense paramilitary campaign of harassment, sabotage, propaganda against Cuba, and an attempted assassination against Castro. Nearby in the Dominican Republic, the United States had already supported the assassination of dictator Rafael Trujillo in order to preempt a Castro-type takeover. In Africa, significant paramilitary aid was given in support of anti-Soviet African leaders. In Asia, American intelligence had been involved for a long time in the Indochina struggle. The CIA, along with the rest of the United States government, was drawn ever deeper into the Vietnamese conflict. Early in the decade, the United States faced its most serious post-war crisis, affecting its security. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 It illustrated a number of important facts concerning the nature and structure of American intelligence. During the summer of 1962, overhead reconnaissance confirmed agent intelligence reports that some form of unusual military installation was being placed in Cuba. By October 16, it was clear that these were end of page 33, beginning of page 34, medium and intermediate range ballistic missile sites capable of handling nuclear weapons that could strike targets throughout significant areas of the United States. As the United States moved toward a confrontation with the Soviet Union, U.S. intelligence played a significant role at every turn. Overhead reconnaissance of the Soviet strategic posture was vastly superior to that of the Russians. Reports from Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, the U.S. agent in the Kremlin, kept the United States abreast of the Soviet military response to the crisis. U.S. tactical reconnaissance of Cuba not only prepared the United States for possible invasion, but signaled the earnestness of our intention to do so should the situation deteriorate. Naval reconnaissance kept close tabs on Soviet ships bearing ballistic missile components. As the crisis neared its showdown with a quarantine, the President demanded and received the most detailed tactical intelligence, including the distance in yards between American naval vessels and the Soviet transport ships. This crisis dramatized the importance of integrated intelligence collection and production in times of crisis. It also clearly illustrated the difficulty in distinguishing between national and so-called tactical intelligence. This distinction has been a central feature of the structure of the American intelligence community, with the military services maintaining control over tactical intelligence and the so-called national intelligence assets subject to varying degrees of control by the Director of Central Intelligence, or the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Council. Cuba proved that in time of crisis, these distinctions evaporate. J. Technology and tragedy. During the 1960s, the U.S. intelligence community was dominated by two developments. First, the enormous explosion in the volume of technical intelligence, as the research and development efforts of the previous period came to fruition. Second, the ever-growing involvement of the United States in the war in Vietnam. The increase in the quantity and quality of technically acquired information on Soviet military forces, in particular, strategic forces, made possible precise measurement of the existing level of Soviet strategic deployments. However, it did not answer questions about the ultimate scale of Soviet strategic deployments, nor did it provide firm information on the quality of their forces. While it provided an additional clue as to Soviet intentions, it did not offer any definitive answers. In the Pentagon, desperate estimates of future Soviet strategic power from each of the armed services led Secretary Robert McNamara to establish the Defense Intelligence Agency. The Secretary of Defense was in the ironic position of being responsible for the bulk of American intelligence collection activity, but lacking the means to coordinate either the collection programs or the intelligence produced. The DIA was to fulfill this need, but in a compromise with the military services, the DIA was made to report to the Secretary of Defense through the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The DIA has never fulfilled its promise, In the CIA, the analysis confronted by the new mass of technical intelligence information underestimated the ultimate scale of Soviet. End of page 34, beginning page 35. Deployments. While tending to overestimate the qualitative aspects of Soviet weapon systems, previously, intelligence analysts had to build up their picture of Soviet capability from fragmentary information, inference, and speculation, particularly as to Soviet purposes. Confronted with the challenge to exploit the new sources of intelligence on Soviet programs, the analysts in the intelligence community turned away from the more speculative task of understanding Soviet purposes and intentions, even though insight into these questions was central to a greater understanding of the technical information being acquired in such quantity. The war in Vietnam also posed serious problems in the analysis and production of intelligence. In effect, the analysts were continually in the position of having to bring bad news to top policymakers. The result produced some serious anomalies in the nature of intelligence estimates concerning the Vietnam conflict. For example, the CIA continually flew in the face of the Pentagon and the evident desires of the White House by denigrating the effectiveness of the bombing campaigns over North Vietnam. But as American involvement deepened from 1965 onward, the CIA was unwilling to take on the larger and more important task of assessing the possibility for the success of the overall U.S. effort in Vietnam. The increase in technical collection capabilities of the United States were also brought to bear on that conflict, creating in its turn more important questions about the application of such resources to tactical situations. As one intelligence officer put it, local military commanders in Vietnam, quote, were getting SIGINT, signals intelligence, with their orange juice every morning and have now come to expect it everywhere, end quote. This involves two problems. First, whether, quote, national, end quote, intelligence resources aimed at strategic problems should be diverted to be used for local combat application. And second, whether this might not lead to a compromise of technical collection systems and the elimination of their effectiveness for broader strategic missions. Okay. The 70s. Together, the advent of increased technical capabilities and the Vietnam War brought a climax to concerns with the government over the centralized management of intelligence resources. This coincided with increased dissatisfaction in the Nixon administrations over the quality of intelligence produced on the war and on Soviet strategic developments. In the nation as a whole, the impact of the Vietnam War destroyed the foreign policy consensus which had underpinned America's intelligence activities abroad. Starting with the disclosures of the CIA involvement with the National Student Association of 1967, there were a series of adverse revelations concerning the activities of the Central Intelligence Agency and the military intelligence agencies. Concern over the secret war in Laos, revulsion at the Phoenix program, which took at least 20,000 lives in South Vietnam, Army spying on U.S. civilians, U.S., quote, destabilization, end quote, efforts in Chile, and finally, the revelations concerning Operation Chaos and the CIA's domestic intelligence role created a climate for a thorough congressional investigation. End of page 35, beginning page 36. During the same period, the executive moved to initiate certain management reforms. Beginning as early as 1968, there were cutbacks in the scale of overall intelligence community. These cutbacks deepened by 1970, both in the size of the overall intelligence budget in real terms and in the manpower devoted to intelligence activities. CIA covert activities were sharply reduced, with a few notable exceptions, such as Chile. The internal security mission in foreign countries was dropped. There was a re-emphasis on collecting covert intelligence on the Soviet Union. Terrorism and narcotics were added to the list of intelligence requirements for our clandestine espionage services. In 1971, James Schlesinger, then serving in the Office of Management and Budget, was asked to do a sweeping analysis of the intelligence community. That study led to an effort to increase the authority of the Director of Central Intelligence over the management of the intelligence community. However, President Nixon limited the scope of reform to that which could be accomplished without legislation. Congress also took an increased interest in the activities of the intelligence community. The role of the CIA in the Watergate affair was examined in the Senate Watergate Committee's investigation. At the close of 1974, a rider, the Hughes-Ryan Amendment, was added to the Foreign Assistance Act, which required the President to certify that covert actions were important to the national security interest, and directed that the Congress should be fully informed of them. In this connection, the responsibility to inform the Congress was broadened beyond the traditional armed services and appropriations committees of the Congress to include the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee. However, the first real effort of the Congress to come to grips with the challenge posed to the American democratic form of government by necessarily secret foreign and military intelligence activities came with the establishment of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence in January of 1975. The results of its inquiry are set forth in the following chapters of this report. L. The task ahead. The American intelligence community has changed remarkably from the early post-war days, yet some of the major problems of that period persist. The intelligence community is still highly decentralized. The problem of maintaining careful command and control over risky secret activities is still great. There is a continuing difficulty in drawing a line between national intelligence activities, which should be closely supervised by the highest levels of government, and tactical intelligence, which are the province of the military services and the departments. Positive steps undertaken by President Ford in his recent executive order have not diminished the need for a new statutory framework for the American intelligence activities. Only through the legislative process can the broad political consensus be expressed which is necessary for continuing the conduct of those intelligence activities, essential to the nation's security and diplomacy. Clark M. Clifford, who was one of the authors of the 1947 National Security Act that established the present legislative framework for America's intelligence activities, made these comments in open session before the committee. End of page 36, beginning of page 37. As one attempts to analyze the difficulty hopefully offer constructive suggestions for improvement, he finds much confusion existing within the system. It is clear that lines of authority and responsibility have become blurred and indistinct. The National Security Council, under the Act of 1947, is given the responsibility of directing our country's intelligence activities. My experience leads me to believe that this function has not been effectively performed. The 1947 law creating the CIA should be substantially amended, and a new law should be written covering intelligence functions. We have had almost 30 years of experience under the old law and have learned a great deal. I believe it has served us reasonably well, but its defects have become increasingly apparent. A clear, more definitive bill can clear lines of authority and responsibility, and by carefully restricting certain activities, we can hopefully prevent the abuses of the past. And Mr. Clifford concluded, "We have a big job to do in this country. Our confusion about our national goals and cynical about our institutions. Our national spirit seems to have been replaced by national malaise. It is my conviction that the efforts of this committee will assist us in regaining confidence in our national integrity and in helping us to restore our nation to its reputation in the world for decency, fair dealing, and moral leadership." Footnote 6. Clifford, December 5th, 75. Hearings, page 53. Resuming reading. That is the spirit in which the Select Committee sought to pursue its inquiry, and that is the spirit in which the committee puts forward the following analysis of the intelligence community and the operation of its constituent parts. End of page 37, beginning page 38. 3. The constitutional framework for intelligence activities. A. The joint responsibilities of the legislative and executive branches, separation of powers, and checks and balances. While the Constitution contains no provisions expressly allocating authority for intelligence activity, the Constitution's provisions regarding foreign affairs and national defense are directly relevant. From the beginning, U.S. foreign intelligence activity, footnote 1, has been conducted in connection with our foreign relations and national defense. Footnote 1. A definition of the term, quote, foreign intelligence activity, end quote, is necessary in order to properly assess the constitutional aspects of foreign intelligence activity. Foreign intelligence activity is now understood to include secret information gathering and covert action. Covert action is defined by the CIA as secret action designed to influence events abroad, including use of political means or varying degrees of force. Political means can range from employment of propaganda to large-scale efforts to finance foreign political parties or groups so as to influence elections or overthrow governments. Covert action involving the use of force may include U.S. paramilitary operations or the support of military operations by foreign conventional or unconventional military organizations. Memorandum from Mitchell Rogovin, Special Counsel to the Director of Central Intelligence. House Select Committee on Intelligence Hearings. December 9th, 75, page 1730. Resuming reading. In these areas, as in all aspects of our government, the Constitution provides for a system of checks and balances under the separation of powers doctrine. In foreign affairs and national defense, Congress and the President were both given important powers. The Constitution, as Madison explained in The Federalist, established, quote, a partial mixture of powers, end quote, footnote 2. Reading footnote 2. The Federalist, number 47, J. Madison. Resuming reading. Unless the branches of government, Madison said, quote, be so far connected and blended as to give each a constitutional control over the others, the degree of separation which the maxim requires as essential to a free government can never in practice be maintained, end quote. Footnote 3. Footnote 3. The Federalist, number 48, J. Madison. Resuming the reading. The framers' underlying purpose, as Justice Brandeis points out, was, quote, to preclude the exercise of arbitrary power, end quote. Footnote 4. Footnote 4. Mayors versus United States, 272, U.S. 52, 292. 1926. Resuming reading. This pattern of checks and balances is reflected in the constitutional provision with respect to foreign affairs and national defense. In foreign affairs, the President has the power to make treaties and to appoint ambassadors and envoys, but this power is subject to, quote, advice and consent, end quote, of the Senate. Footnote 5. Footnote 5. United States Constitution, Article 2, Section 2. Resuming reading. While the President has exclusive power to receive ambassadors from foreign states, footnote 6, the Congress has important powers of its own in foreign affairs, most notably the power to regulate foreign commerce and to lay duties, footnote 7. Footnote 6, IBID, Section 3. Footnote 7, IBID, Article 1, Section 8. End of page 38, beginning page 39. In national defense, the President is made Commander-in-Chief, thereby having the power to command the armed forces, to direct military operations once Congress has declared war, and to repel sudden attacks. Footnote 8. Reading footnote 8. IBID, Article 2, Section 2. Resuming reading. Congress, however, has the exclusive power to declare war, to raise and support the armed forces, to make rules for their government and regulation, to call forth the militia, to provide for the common defense, and to make appropriations for all national defense activities. Footnote 9. Reading footnote 9. IBID, Section 8. Resuming reading. Moreover, under the necessary and proper clause, the Constitution specifies that Congress shall have the power, quote, to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution, end quote. not only its own powers but also, quote, all other powers vested by the Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof, end quote. Footnote 10. Reading footnote 10. IBID. Resuming reading. The constitutional framework animated by the checks and balances concept makes clear that the Constitution contemplates that the judgment of both Congress and the President will be applied to major decisions in foreign affairs and national defense. The President, the holder of, quote, the executive power, end quote, conducts daily relations with other nations through the State Department and other agencies. The Senate, through its, quote, advice and consent, end quote, power, through the work of its appropriate committees, participates in foreign affairs. As Hamilton observed in the Federalist, foreign affairs should not be left to the, quote, sole disposal, end quote, of the President. The history of human conduct does not warrant that exalted opinion of human virtue which would make it wise to commit interests of so delicate and momentous a kind as those which concern its intercourse with the rest of the world, to the sole disposal of a magistrate, created and circumstanced as would be a President of the United States. Footnote 11. Reading footnote 11. The Federalist, number 75. A. Hamilton. Resuming reading. Similarly, in national defense, the constitutional framework is a, quote, partial mixture of powers, end quote, calling for collaboration between the executive and legislative branches. The Congress, through its exclusive power to declare war, alone decides whether the nation shall move from a state of peace to a state of war, while as Commander-in-Chief the President commands the armed forces. Congress empowered, quote, to make rules, end quote, for their, quote, government and regulation, end quote. Footnote 12. Reading footnote 12. United States Congress, Article 1, Section 8. Resuming reading. Moreover, in both the foreign affairs and defense fields, while the power over the purse is charged with authority to determine whether or to what extent government activities in these areas shall be funded. Footnote 13. Reading footnote 13. IBID, Article 2, Section 8. Resuming reading. The Constitution, while containing no express authority for the conduct of foreign intelligence activity, clearly endowed the federal government, i.e., Congress and the President jointly, with all the power necessary to conduct a nation's foreign affairs and national. End of page 39. Beginning page 40. Defense. And to stand on equal basis with other sovereign states. Footnote 14. Reading footnote 14. As the Supreme Court has declared, quote, the United States, in their relation to foreign countries, are invested with the powers which belong to independent nations, end quote. Chinese exclusion case, 130 U.S. 581, 604, year 1889, or just 1889. Resuming reading. Inasmuch as foreign intelligence activity is a part of the conduct of the United States' foreign affairs and national defense, as well as part of the practice of sovereign states, the federal government has the constitutional authority to undertake such activity in accordance with applicable norms of international law. Footnote 14a. Reading footnote 14a. There are a number of international agreements which the United States has entered into, which prohibit certain forms of intervention in the domestic affairs of foreign states. The the Nation's Charter, in Article 2, 4, obligation all UN members to, quote, refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity of any state, end quote. The Charter of the Organization of American States, OAS, in Article 18 provides, quote, no state or group of states has the right to intervene, directly or indirectly, for any reason whatever, in the internal or external affairs of any other state. The foregoing principle prohibits not only armed force, but also any other form of interference or attempted threat against the personality of the state or against its political, economic, and cultural elements, end quote. Under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, Article 6, Section 2, treaty obligations of the United States are part of the law of the land, while the general principles of such treaties have not been spelled out in specific rules of application, and much depends on the facts of particular cases, as well as other principles of international law, including the right of self-preservation and the right to assist states against prior foreign intervention. It is clear that the norms of international law are relevant in assessing the legal and constitutional aspects of any covert action. Resuming the reading. We discuss below the manner in which Congress and the executive branch have undertaken to exercise this federal power, and the consistency of their action with the Constitution's framework and system of checks and balances. B. Historic practice. The National Security Act of 1947, footnote 14b, was a landmark in the evolution of United States foreign intelligence. Reading footnote 14b. 50 U.S.C. 430. Resuming the reading. In the 1947 Act, Congress created the National Security Council and the CIA, giving both of these entities a statutory charter. Prior to 1947, Congress, despite its substantial authority in foreign affairs and national defense, did not legislate directly with respect to foreign intelligence activity. Under the Necessary and Proper Clause and its power to make rules and regulations for the armed forces, Congress might have elaborated specific situations authorizing and regulating the conduct of foreign intelligence. In the absence of such statutes, presidents conduct foreign intelligence activity prior to the 1947 National Security Act on their own authority. In wartime, the president's power as commander-in-chief provided ample authority for both the secret gathering of information and covert action. Footnote 15. Reading footnote 15. In Totem versus United States, 92 U.S. 105, 1875, the Supreme Court upheld the authority of the President to hire, without statutory authority, a secret agent for intelligence purposes during the Civil War. Authority for wartime covert action can be implied from the President's powers as Commander-in-Chief to conduct military operations in a war declared by Congress. Compare Totem versus United States. Resuming the reading. The authority to collect foreign intelligence information before 1947 in peacetime can be viewed as implied from the end of page 40, beginning of page 41, President's power to conduct foreign affairs. Footnote 16. Reading footnote 16. Compare United States versus Butenko, 494, F. 2nd, 593, 3D CIR 1974. Quote, decisions affecting the United States' relationship with other sovereign states are more likely to advance our national interests if the President is apprised of the intentions, capabilities, and possible responses of other countries, end quote. Resuming the reading. In addition to the more or less discreet act of gathering information by the regular diplomatic service, the President sometimes used specifically appointed, quote, executive agents, end quote, to secretly gather information abroad. Footnote 17. Reading footnote 17. Henry Wriston, Executive Agents in American Foreign Relations, 1929-1967. Resuming the reading. In addition, executive agents were on occasion given secret political missions that were similar to modern-day political covert action. Footnote 18. Reading footnote 18. IBID, page 693, et sequential, or et seq. Resuming the reading. These, however, tended to be in the form of relatively small-scale responses to particular concerns, rather than the continuous institutionalized activity that marked the character of covert action in the period after the passage of the 1947 National Security Act. There were no precedents for the peacetime use of covert action involving the use of armed force of the type conducted after 1947. 1. Foreign intelligence and the President's foreign affairs power. Although the Constitution provides that the President, quote, shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers, and consuls, end quote, only, quote, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, end quote, beginning with Washington presidents, have appointed special envoys to carry out both overt diplomatic functions and foreign intelligence missions. Footnote 19. Reading footnote 19. The first such specially appointed individual was Governor Morris, sent by President Washington in 1789 as a, quote, private agent, end quote, to Britain, to explore the possibilities for opening normal diplomatic relations. Morris was appointed in October 1789 because Washington's Secretary of State, Jefferson, was not yet functioning. The mission was not reported to Congress until February 1791. Henry Wriston, quote, the Special Envoy, Foreign Affairs, 38, 1960, page 219, 220. Resuming the reading. The great majority of these envoys were sent on overt missions, such as to negotiate treaties or represent the United States at international conferences. Some, however, were sent in secrecy to carry out the near equivalent of modern-day intelligence collection and covert political action. For example, in connection with U.S. territorial designs on central and western Canada in 1869, President Grant's Secretary of State sent a private citizen to that area to investigate and promote the possibility of annexation to the United States. Footnote 20. Reading footnote 20. Riston, Executive Agents in American Foreign Relations, page 739. Resuming reading. Presidential discretion as to the appointment of such executive agents derived from the President's assumption of the conduct of foreign relations. From the beginning, the President represented the United States to the world and had exclusive charge of the channels and processes of communication. The President's role as, quote, sole organ, end quote, of the nation in dealing with foreign states was recognized by John Marshall in 1816, footnote 21, and reflected in the views expressed in the Federalist. Reading footnote 21. Marshall spoke not as Chief Justice in an opinion of the Supreme Court, but rather in a statement to the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives was engaged in a debate as to whether a demand by the British government for the extradition of one Robbins was a matter for the courts or for the President, acting upon an extradition treaty. Marshall argued that the case involved, quote, a national demand made upon the nation, end quote. Since the President is the quote, sole organ of the nation in its external relations, end quote, Marshall said, quote, of consequence, the demand can only be made upon him, end quote. 10 Annals of Congress, 613, 1800. Printed in 5 wheat, Appendix Note Number 1, at 26, U.S. 1820. End of page 41, beginning page 42. That the characteristics of the presidency, unity, secrecy, decision, dispatch, were especially suited to the conduct of diplomacy. Footnote 22. Reading footnote 22. Nor did Marshall intend to say that, quote, sole organ, end quote, meant the power of, quote, sole disposal, end quote. As the eminent constitutional expert Edward S. Corrin wrote, quote, clearly what Marshall had foremost in mind was simply the President's role as instrument of communication with other governments, end quote. Edward S. Corwin, The President's Control of Foreign Relations, page 216. Resuming the reading. As a consequence, historical development saw the President take charge of the daily conduct of foreign affairs, including the formation of much of the nation's foreign policy, but, quote, sole organ, end quote, as to communications with foreign governments and historical practice did not amount to, quote, sole disposal, end quote, in a constitutional sense over foreign affairs. As Hamilton declared, the Constitution did not grant that degree of power to the President in foreign affairs. Footnote 23. Footnote 23. The Federalist, number 75, A. Hamilton. Resuming the reading. Moreover, Marshall's reference to the President as, quote, sole organ did not purport that to mean that the President was not subject to congressional regulation. should Congress wish to act. For Marshall, in addition to speaking of the President as, quote, sole organ, end quote, went on to point out that, quote, Congress unquestionably may prescribe the mode, end quote, by which such power to act was to be exercised. Footnote 24. Reading footnote 24. Citing Marshall's expression, the Supreme Court has recognized the President as, quote, sole organ, end quote, of communication and negotiation in foreign affairs. United States versus Curtis Wright, Export Corp., 299, U.S. 304, 1952. Although dicta of Justice Sutherland in the Curtis Wright opinion put forward a broad view of the court involved, as Justice Jackson stated in his opinion in the Steele seizure case, quote, not the question of the President's power to act without congressional authority, but the question of his right to act under and in accord with an act of Congress, end quote. Youngstown Steel and Tube Co. versus Sawyer, 343, U.S. 579, 635, 636. 1952. Concurring opinion. In Curtis Wright, a joint resolution of Congress had authorized the President to embargo weapons to countries at war in the Chaco, CHACO, and impose criminal sanctions for any violation. After Franklin D. Roosevelt proclaimed an embargo, the Curtis Wright Corporation, indicted for violating the embargo, challenged the congressional resolution and the President's proclamation, claiming Congress had made an improper delegation of legislative power to the President. Speaking for 6 justices, Justice Sutherland sustained the indictment, holding only, as Justice Jackson later noted, quote, that the strict limitation upon congressional delegations of power to the President over internal affairs does not apply with respect to delegations of power in external affairs, end quote. 343 U.S. at 636. Resuming the reading. Congress, with its own constitutional powers in foreign affairs, its power over the purse, and under the authority contained in the necessary and proper clause, had the option of regulating the practice of using executive agents on foreign intelligence missions, as well as the conduct of foreign intelligence activity by other means. Footnote 25. Reading footnote 25. In 1973, for example, Congress established a procedure for the financing of secret foreign affairs operations. It enacted a statute providing for expenses of, quote, intercourse or treaty, end quote, with foreign nations. The act required the President to report all such expenditures, but granted him the power to give a certificate in lieu of a report for those payments the President deemed should be kept secret. Act of February 9, 1973. 1 Stat 300. End of page 42, beginning page 43. The executive branch relies in large part on the President's own constitutional powers for authority to conduct such covert action. Footnote 26. Reading footnote 26. In September 1947, the CIA General Counsel expressed the opinion that activity such as, quote, black propaganda, Ranger and commando raids, behind the lines sabotage, and support of guerrilla warfare, end quote, would constitute, quote, an unwarranted extension of the functions authorized, end quote, by the 1947 Act. Memorandum from the CIA General Counsel to Director, September 25, 47. And in 1969, the CIA General Counsel wrote that the 1947 Act provided, quote, rather doubtful statutory authority, end quote, for at least those covert actions, such as paramilitary operations, which were not related to intelligence gathering. Memorandum from CIA General Counsel to Director, October 30th, 69. The agency's General Counsel took the position that the authority for covert action rested on the President's delegation of his own constitutional authority to CIA through various National Security Council directives, IBID. Resuming the reading. After the failure of the Bay of Pigs operation in 1961, the CIA asked the Justice Department for an analysis of the legal authority for covert actions. In its response, the Justice Department Office of Legislative Counsel stated, "It would appear that the executive branch, under the direction of the President, has been exercising without express statutory authorization a function which is within the constitutional powers of the President, and that the CIA was the agent selected by the President to carry out these functions." Footnote 27. Reading footnote 27. Memorandum, Office of Legislative Counsel, Department of Justice, January 17, 62, page 11. Resuming the reading. The Justice Department memorandum pointed to the President's foreign relations power and his responsibility for national security. Footnote 28. Reading footnote 28. IBID, page 7. The memorandum stated, quote, under modern conditions of, quote, Cold War, end quote, the President can properly regard the conduct of covert activities as necessary to the effect and successful conduct of foreign relations and the protection of the national security. When the United States is attacked from without or within, the President may, quote, meet force with force, end quote, in wagering a worldwide contest to strengthen the free nations and contain the, quote, the communist nations, and thereby to preserve the existence of the United States. The President should be deemed to have comparable authority to meet activities with covert activities, if he deems such action necessary and consistent with our national objectives, end quote. Resuming the reading. Arguing by analogy from the President's power as Commander-in-Chief to conduct a declared war, the memorandum contended that the President could conduct peacetime covert actions involving armed force without authority from Congress. The memorandum argued that there was no limit to the means the President might deploy in exercising his foreign affairs power. Just as, quote, the power to wage war is the power to wage war successfully, end quote, so the power of the President to conduct foreign relations should be deemed to be the power to conduct foreign relations successfully by any means necessary to combat the measures taken by the communist bloc, including both open and covert measures. Footnote 29. Emphasis added. Reading footnote 29. IBID. Resuming the reading. In view of the Constitution's grant of concurrent jurisdiction to Congress in foreign affairs and Congress's exclusive constitutional authority to declare war, there is little to support such an extravagant claim of presidential power in peacetime. The case which prompted the Justice Department's argument, the invasion of Cuba at the Bay, end of page 43, beginning of page 44, of Pigs, illustrates that the serious constitutional questions which arise. In that operation, the President in effect authorized the CIA to secretly direct and finance the military invasion of a foreign country. This action approached and may have constituted an act of war. At the least, it seriously risked placing the United States in a state of war vis-a-vis Cuba on the sole authority of the President, absent the threat of sudden attack or grave and immediate threat to the security of the country. Only Congress under the Constitution has such authority. As James Madison declared, Congress's power to declare war includes, quote, the power of judging the causes of war, end quote. Footnote 30. Reading footnote 30. Letters of Helvetius, 1793. Madison Writings, Volume 6, page 174. Hunt edition. Resuming the reading. Madison wrote, every just view that can be taken of the subject admonishes the public of the necessity of a rigid adherence to the simple, the received, and the fundamental doctrine of the Constitution, that the power to declare war, including the power of judging the causes of war, is fully and exclusively vested in the legislature, end quote. Footnote 31. Reading footnote 31. IBID. Resuming the reading. This view was also affirmed by Hamilton, who, although a principal exponent of expansive presidential power, wrote that it is the exclusive province of Congress, when the nation is at peace, to change that state into a state of war. It belongs to Congress only to go to war. Footnote 32. Reading footnote 32. Hamilton, Works, Volume 8, pages 249 to 250. Lodge edition. Resuming the reading. Nor is there much support in historic practice prior to 1950 for the use of armed force to achieve foreign policy objectives on the sole authority of the President. The 1962 Justice Department memorandum argued that the practice of presidents in using force to protect American citizens and property abroad was authority for covert action involving armed force. Footnote 33. Reading footnote 33. Justice Department Memorandum, January 17, 62, page 2. Resuming the reading. Before the post-World War II era, presidents on occasion asserted their own authority to use armed force short of war. but as the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations noted in 1973, these operations were for, quote, limited, minor, or essentially non-political purposes, end quote, as the Foreign Relations Committee stated. During the course of the 19th century, it became accepted practice, if not strict constitutional doctrine, for presidents acting on their own authority to use armed forces for such limited purposes as the suppression of piracy and the slave trade for, quote, hot pursuit, end quote, of criminals across borders, and for the protection of American lives and property in places abroad where local government was not functioning effectively. An informal operative distinction came to be accepted between the use of armed forces for limited, minor, or essentially non-political purposes, and the use of armed forces for, quote, acts of war, end quote, in the sense of large-scale military operations against sovereign states. Footnote 34. Reading footnote 34. Senate Report Number 220, 93rd Congress, First Session, 1973. Resuming the reading, that these operations were, as the Committee on Foreign Relations noted, for, quote, limited, minor, or essentially non-political purposes, end quote, is also, end of page 44, beginning page 45, affirmed by the eminent authority on constitutional law, Edward Corwin. Prior to the Korean War, the, quote, vast majority, end quote, of such cases, Corwin wrote, quote, involved fights with pirates, landing of small naval contingents on barbarous coasts to protect American citizens, the dispatch of small bodies of troops to chase bandits or cattle rustlers across the Mexican border. Footnote 35. Reading footnote 35. Edward S. Corwin, quote, the President's power, end quote, in Haight and Johnson, eds. The President's role and powers, 1965, page 361. And I'm going to stop here for today's recording, and I intend to pick back up in the next one.